Right, hello there. It's Jacob here from Authentic Gay Blog. This is a follow-up to the review I did of It's a Sin. Now, to give some context, because I would imagine the majority of the younger gay and bisexual male community will have no idea whatsoever as to what it was like back then, and may feel the programme over-dramatised things. Well, I can tell you categorically it didn't. Okay, so the three characters who died of HIV-related conditions were all really quite different characters, and they probably would actually accurately represent what was happening. So the first one was Gloria, who was a guy in his 30s who was a bus conductor on the London buses. Now, there wasn't a lot of detail about his sex life, so we don't really know what he was up to. However, you know, he, like a lot of men at the time, when the virus was just becoming known, in a few countries of the world, America, the UK and some other European countries, when gay men primarily were starting to develop these illnesses that perplexed medical people of the time, because they were conditions that would be associated with people who were in old age, or of certain ethnic minorities, you know. So one being KS, which is Karsopi something, cancer basically, and they're the lesions, and they're normally associated with people who live in the Mediterranean. Yet guys in the UK were developing it, and it perplexed them. The primary one was pneumonia, and lung conditions, specifically pneumonia, and they were wondering why guys were developing this really serious case of pneumonia. Anyway, so in Gloria's case, that's what happens to Gloria. You know, he develops pneumonia, gets better, gets sick again, gets better, gets sick again, and dies. Now, that was the story. Guys got sick, they got better, they got sick, they got better, but every time they got sick, they got sicker and took longer to recover until they realised what was going on, and they still didn't quite know how it was transmitted. So even though there were rumours going around that it was sexually transmitted, at the time the gay and bisexual male community were very resistant to changing their sexual behaviour, and they kind of thought that people were trying to stop them from having sex, and they were lying about it. You know, at one time they thought it was caused by poppers, you know. So they didn't really know. It wasn't until time progressed that they realised that it was transmitted either through sex or blood transfusions or sharing needles. That it was, you know, there was a specific route of transmission that had to take place. Although at the time, the media, especially in the UK, was full of basically avoid gay men. Don't go anywhere near a gay man because you'll catch AIDS, and it was really quite horrifying. Even in the 90s, people still didn't know very much, or they should know, because the medical profession and all of the sexual health organisations were widely telling people how HIV was transmitted. However, I used to volunteer at the Terence Higgins Trust, and I worked later on in the late 90s, I worked in the volunteer office. And even in 1999, my friend was volunteering on the helpline, and she came down to me and she said, "I can't believe a call I've just taken. Someone's just rang up saying they sat on the same chair on the tube as a gay guy and had touched the metal bar of the tube where he typed had he contracted HIV. That was in 1999. So you can imagine what people were like in the 80s. So Colin, you know, and what happened with him, with his stuff being burnt by his family, that happened. That really, 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 really did happen. People burnt everything that the person owned because they were so scared of catching HIV, you know. It wasn't until, like I just said, until the late 80s that people began to get a much clearer message. Now, that was mostly, the reason that happened was mostly down to gay and bisexual men and their friends and allies. You know, the very few straight people at the time who didn't have a problem with gay men who were friends and lost friends. It was down to them getting off their arses because the government weren't doing it. The Conservative government at the time had their head in their sand and they didn't know what to do. A bit like how they're coping with the current coronavirus, really. You know, there's not much difference. So that happened because in 1982 a gay man called Terence Higgins died at Prompton Hospital, and like the night after he died, a group of his friends got together in a club, I think it was in London, I think it might have been JY or Bang, and they got together and discussed what were they going to do, you know, how can we react. And this was the gay and bisexual male community, so they got together and they started doing the research and putting together the information, and the Terence Higgins Trust came about, and then other organisations came about as a result of that. You have to remember, this was when society was vehemently homophobic. You know, if you remember, if you've watched It's a Sin, at the end of it, the guy that infected Colin is on the HIV ward, and his mum comes in and says, he's not a dirty queer, he kind of done this. You know, that was in 1991. You know, so we faced, as a community, we faced the worst levels of homophobia ever because HIV was out there. The media had a tool to beat us with, you know, so the papers were full of these stories, you know, queer, dirty, filthy perverts spreading AIDS, put them on an island, kill them, you know, this was every day in the press. You know, the levels of homophobia were through the roof, and as a community we stood, like in the program, you know, they were very tight in their little unit in the house, looking after each other, taking care of each other. That is what it was like, because we had to do that. You know, we had to do that. We had to look after each other. We had no choice, you know, but we responded with strength. Such strength we showed in how we responded, you know. Now, the second character, Colin, that broke my heart when Colin died. Honestly, I had to stop watching the programme. I had to take a break for a couple of hours before I could watch episode 4 and 5. When Colin died, that broke my heart, you know. And, you know, the perception, even in the gay community, the perception was, at the time, that only the sluts would get HIV, you know. Only the whores and the people who were slagging about and having hundreds of sexual partners, they were the ones who were going to get AIDS and die, you know. That was what was happening. Now, Colin's story is actually, he had sex with one person. You know, that was the context. At the end, you know, it was kind of revealed that he'd had sex with the lodger's son, his landlady's son, who's the lady who says, my son's not a queer, at the end, you know. So the landlady's son, carried shame about being gay and couldn't admit to being gay, and he was really raping Colin every week while she was out doing bingo or something. And obviously Colin was attracted to him. Fuck knows why. It was a skinny thing, you know. Colin was attracted to him, and you know, he you know, sexually assaulted him on a weekly basis. You know, he was fucking him, and obviously he had HIV, and he gave Colin HIV, and Colin either only ever slept with him or a very small number of people. So it showed that really what the reality of the time was. HIV and contracting HIV through sex was Russian roulette. You know, it was a case of you could have sex with one person ever and contract HIV, or you could have sex with hundreds of guys and not get HIV. You know, but at the time we didn't know that. It wasn't, like I've said a couple of times in this video to affirm the point. It wasn't until later on we became more aware. That's why condom use, I think, wasn't really discussed very much in the series, and not until the end, you know, where they started to wear condoms and stuff. But the third character, who was the protagonist, who actually died last, if you recall, he was in complete denial about it. Now, that was the case. There was, in the early days, a lot of denial in the community about what was happening, you know, but there was also a lot of fear as well. And there was, if you remember, the guys who were starting to talk about it were ridiculed by the rest of the community, you know, for doing that. And even you know, later on there was a lot of shaming of guys like me who were doing the sexual health promotion. You know, we were called the condom police and all kinds of shit like that, you know, basically, you know, criticised for what we were doing, because we were, you know, shaming guys, you know, because they were having unsafe sex, you know. So, you know, his character, interestingly enough, had sex with loads of people, and at the end, Jill, who was my favourite character, and Colin was my favourite character, Jill confronts the mum. Now the mum doesn't tell Jill that he has died until the next day, even though she knows she's staying on the Isle of Wight because she wants to see her good friend, you know. And at the end, Jill confronts her and said, it was shame that killed your son, and you killed your son. You killed your son through your homophobia and your bigotry, basically, you know, because he felt ashamed of being gay, and he felt ashamed of who he was, you know, and he went on to infect hundreds of guys with HIV because he knew he had HIV, but he was still not wearing condoms and having safer sex because of shame, because of the shame of the bigotry of him being gay and the shame of him having HIV, you know. And in a lot of respects that is very true, you know. As the virus progressed and as time wore on, you know, we'd then, by 1991, we'd faced like 10 years of vehement homophobia directed at our community, at my community, you know. And when I came out in 92, it was still just as bad as that. And even when I was volunteering, as I did from literally 6 months after I came out as gay, I was volunteering at HIV charities, you know, because I was so upset about what was going on in my community about it. And, you know, 1,500 gay men a year were dying towards the mid-90s, just before the vaccinations, the medications came in. And they were the early days of the medication. And in the early days of the medications, people were taking 30 to 40 tablets a day, you know, like it was hardcore. And my friend Paul died literally weeks before those medications became widely available. I mean, he was on AZT, which didn't work, you know, and he was 29, 30 when he died, in the prime of his life, you know. So 1,500 of us a year were dying, you know. And the stigma and the discrimination was horrific. You know, the story of a funeral, like I said in my previous video, happened a lot, you know. Because I volunteered and I was part of these organisations that were doing the work supporting people and doing like buddying and welfare rights advice and practical help, you know, return seeking trustees, do a lot of things for people who were living with HIV at the time, because they were basically very, very ill. Not like they are today, you know, so they couldn't do things. So people would go around and do their gardens, clean their houses, buy their shopping. You know, the stories that they would tell about the family rejection, the homophobia they'd experienced and stuff, it broke my heart. It was horrible. I mean, I really can't emphasize how horrible it was. And watching those 5 episodes really brought it home to me, really reminded me. And I'd forgotten how bad it was. And it reminded me of how awful it was, you know. So the series didn't over exaggerate what was going on. I think it was really accurate and fair in what it portrayed. And, you know, I really believe the younger gay male community, bisexual male community, should be forced to watch this. They should really know what we put up with, what people over the age of 40, 45, I'd probably say 45 years old, what we put up with, what we dealt with, what we had to face in terms of it, you know, and the trauma of it as well is massive, you know. And it was true, you know. A lot of guys felt shame. A lot of guys did not use condoms, did not do anything like that, because they were ashamed of being gay. They felt a deep shame at being gay, and like she said, you know, they thought they deserved it. They deserved to get this disease and die. You know, not like just die quickly. No. They didn't just decide die. Deserve to die quickly like you do if you shoot yourself in the head with a gun. No, they had to die horrible, slow, painful deaths. You know, withering away to nothing, basically disappearing into nothing, from being healthy guys to being little sticks who could barely breathe, covered in lesions, dying horrible deaths in their own fucking shit and piss in hospital beds. You know, dying alone. You know, that is what was going on. And that is because society was so fucking homophobic at the time. It was horribly homophobic, you know, and we really have to acknowledge that. And I think as a community, especially as a gay male community, we really need to acknowledge that, and we really need to hold people to account for that, you know. And to make matters worse, the government brought in Section 28, which basically prohibited schools, colleges, local authorities talking about, the word they used, promoting homosexuality as a viable alternative to the heterosexual lifestyle. You know, and Margaret Thatcher, you can YouTube it, there's a famous clip where she's talking at the 1987 Conservative Party conference, and she says, people believe they have an inalienable right to be lesbian and gay, and this isn't right. Yes. I mean, that is why I'm never going to vote Conservative ever in my life, because I cannot forgive them for that. And you might think, well, what's that got to do with what we've just said? It's got everything to do with it, because this was 1988. This was at the peak of the HIV crisis, you know, just before the AZT came along, which wasn't that effective anyway, and like almost 10 years before the combination therapy came along, you know. So all these young men, all these young gay and bisexual men in school and college were not getting a sexual health message, not even getting let alone getting a sexual health message. They weren't even getting a message that it was okay to be gay. There was no support available. There was no education around LGBT issues. So young people in the education system had no idea about LGBT stuff, you know, nothing, no idea whatsoever. So they didn't have a context to work with, you know. So when you're getting the majority of messages from media and society, and probably your family, that it's dirty queer, dirty this, dirty filthy, horrible homosexuals, you know, you don't get anything to balance that. And the education system should have done that. The education system should have done a fair balance and talked about those issues, but it couldn't because of Section 28. So that caused more people to die, so, but going back to the programme, I've talked for 20 minutes, bloody hell. But going back to the programme, it was really good in how it portrayed it. Obviously so good it's got me riled up about it. And I feel very angry about that time, really angry about that time and what it did to us. But on another level, I feel incredibly proud as well. I feel incredibly proud of my community in the way we dealt with that, we got off our asses and we helped each other, basically. We got off our asses and became proactive and looked for solutions to what was going on. Looked at how we could promote messages of safety and look after each other, and all the sexual health stuff that we have today is a result of the gay and bisexual men who got off their asses and did something, basically. Alright, thank you.